Good morning. My name is Cedricia Thomas, and I am an instructor and facilitator at the Leadership Institute at Columbus State University. Welcome to our webinar on Interruption or Introduction. It's all about your perspective. We're so glad that you're with us today, and we want this session to be interactive. So we will be using the chat feature for polls and questions. Go ahead and type in the chat and let us know if this is your first webinar with us or if you've attended in the past. We will do our best to answer all of your questions during our time together. If there are questions we weren't able to get to, we will save them and send the answers out after the event. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Courtney Laughlin, Director of the Center for Servant Leadership. Courtney Laughlin coordinates and teaches several of the 8 lead courses that serve as the academic foundation of the undergraduate servant leadership program. She's also a graduate of the program. Welcome, Courtney. I will jump in throughout to ask questions from the audience, but for now, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate you, and I appreciate everybody being here this morning, hopefully from the safety of your own dry homes. And I'm very excited to talk with you all today about this topic. And about perspective and our perspective as a leader and how important that is right now during this time. And so the title of our presentation today is going to be Interruption or Introduction. It's all about your perspective. And again, what we're going to be talking about, our perspective today is going to be from a standpoint of leadership development. Because while we do acknowledge that there are lots of different perspectives and takes on what's going on in the world today, we really want to focus in on how can we as leaders use our perspective as a source of power for us right now, and you know, just how important that is in the world right now. For those of us who are leading teams, or maybe even entire organizations, or you know, maybe the most important group of folks, which could be your family at home. And so, you know, now we're just living in this very strange state, right? We feel like we're not really able to progress or move forward quite yet. But at the same time, the world is still spinning. And so therefore we must continue on. For many of us, we're living in a place somewhere stuck between a sense of emergency and this new weird sense of normalcy. We are being told to stay at home, and yet a lot of the things that a lot of our activities are still taking place, and we're still expected to participate in those, even though they're outside of our home. And so I don't know about y'all, but I'm just not really sure what to do with that anymore. It's, excuse me, I've really come to a place where I feel like life is on hold. I feel like somebody hit the pause button and the movie, my life as a movie, is being put on hold. And I'm doing my best to find my new normal. I am encouraging my team as well as my students to do that as well. Being the director of the Center for Servant Leadership means that I work with about 100 undergraduate students. And so, you know, trying to encourage everyone to do that and do it myself can feel impossible at times, just because there is so much uncertainty in our world today. And, you know, for our department, we usually spend this time of year really looking ahead and celebrating. In May, we usually do an end of year celebration, and we spend the summer planning for the fall, and we do, you know, a weekend retreat to kick off school in the fall. And all of those things are things that have been happening in our program for years, a decade, you know, or more. And so for us, you know, to try and book venues or anything like that right now is just really difficult to do or to plan for, because we're not sure that those things are going to be able to happen. And what's even more difficult for me is not being able to tell my students what to expect or what comes next. And so, you know, that's all really a struggle. Even personally, I'm really struggling right now because I am supposed to get married in June, which I'm so excited about. But June 13th is a number that keeps, you know, flashing in my head all of the time. And this season was really supposed to look and feel quite different for me. But because of those plans, big important plans, you know, I have found myself signing up for COVID-19 you know, alerts through different news outlets and things like that. And I'm getting those news updates every couple of hours. And I'm really doing it for the reason of trying to collect all of the information that I can to make an informed decision about what is supposed to be a very joyful occasion in June. But that that's really hard for me. It's really hard to keep my focus on that joy and not be stalled by this lack of progress that we're able to make right now. So, I've caught myself over the last 6 weeks feeling really sad about what feels like a complete loss of control over my own life to this pandemic. And I've caught myself complaining and calling this an interruption, more times than I would really like to admit that I've done. And really what I've decided is all of that is, just been really consuming for me. And again, that's, not something that I love to admit, that something else is having so much control over me. But if I have come to the realization that if I continue to worry about those things that I can't control, they're only going to cause me more grief and anxiety, right? It's not necessarily going to fix the problem. And so what I have decided over the last, 2 weeks or so is that I am going to focus my energy instead on the things, the few things and all of this that I can control. And one of those things is my response to this. And so I, again, have just decided over the last few weeks that this interruption for me is going to be an introduction. It is going to, I'm going to do my best to take what is a problem and turn it into a possibility. What felt like an obstacle into an opportunity, and what at first looked like a stumbling block into a stepping stone. And I've decided to change my attitude towards it, and therefore change my perspective. Perspective is, again, such a powerful thing for us as individuals, but also for leaders. And perspective, it's basically how we see the world, right? You have a definition of perspective, and I think we all understand the general term, but in terms of what we're talking about today as a leader, perspective is how we see the world. It is the lens through which we literally understand the world around us. And so you've probably heard expressions like, oh, yeah, she sees things through rose-colored lenses. So I like to think of it, because I'm a visual person, as actual glasses that we put on, and that our perspective can be very heavily influenced or skewed by whatever those glasses look like. And so I actually was an English literature major as an undergraduate student, and during my time as an English major really loved children's literature and just have a strong affinity for the Wizard of Oz books, that series. And it wasn't, until reading the story of Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz that I learned that the Emerald City is actually only emerald because every person who comes to the Emerald City gets a pair of glasses at the gate. And they then have to put those glasses on, and that's what makes the city the Emerald City, right? So in thinking about that, what does your perspective right now look like? Are your glasses clear? Have you, taken some time to clear them up? Or are they really foggy? Do they have scratches on them? Are your lenses changing your perspective of the world? And so, it's interesting to think about this idea of perspective, and in doing some of my research, thinking about the fact that perspective at some point was discovered is really fascinating to me. So the concept of perception or perspective was not really around until the 14th century, when painters began to use it in their work. Before then, paintings were very, very disproportionate, or they really lacked depth. And so back then, what they were doing is they were mostly painting for religious purposes, and so they were, celebrating religious figures. And in doing so, what they tended to do was to paint important people or objects as larger than other objects in the painting. And again, they're glorifying one of those religious figures, and so therefore it would make sense that that figure might mean it's larger. But when you look at the whole work, and when we look at it now, those differently sized figures look kind of bizarre, because you have a very large queen standing right next to, I don't know, maybe her chambermaid. And it doesn't, it looks like one of them is a giant and one of them is an ant, right? And so that doesn't make sense to us today. But I do think that that is a really great example of how certain figures can, in that instance, be really blown out of proportion, and really out of proportion with the rest of the scene. And that's what a lack of perspective looks like. A lack of perspective is a world in which things are represented larger than they actually are, and therefore it can be blown way out of proportion. And I don't know about y'all, but I can certainly think of things in my life that I blow way out of proportion, right? That end up taking a lot more of my vision and my focus than they should. And it's all because I have allowed that perspective, those proportions, to become skewed. And so, again, perception is really, or being perspective is the ability to see the bigger pictures. It's being able to see the forest as well as the trees. It's not getting, wrapped up in the small details when there are larger issues or bigger issues at hand. And so perspective helps us think simultaneously about life lessons, the way we behave, and what's best for the situation at hand. Again, all at the same time, which I think is so important for us as leaders in a time where things are changing on a daily basis. And perspective allows us to address those important questions, and really becomes extremely powerful for a leader during times of adversity. And I think times of adversity is, what we're living in now. A time of adversity is a time where leaders really start to question, okay, so how do I do that? What does that look like? And thinking about perspective in terms of facing adversity, I want to jump over to some of our results from the pre-poll survey that we did before today's session, and explore how many of us deal with adversity naturally, and what are some things that we could do to maybe address those. And so based on the results that we had from our assessment, or from our pre-poll, or that survey that we put out to you all, it looks like about 20% of the group indicated that they will take immediate action and can overcome it, which is great. It's very fast, very efficient. Another 40% said that they really lean on those people around them and are willing and naturally go to asking for support. Another 20% admit that they let their emotions get the best of them. And I think we all may experience that at some times, and that's extremely understandable. And we also have another 10% that say they are able to maintain a positive attitude through it all. And then another 10% that says that they just simply try and make it go away, maybe try to avoid it. And those 5 responses, from what I have learned, are the most common responses to adversity. We as humans do not love the idea of adversity, and for a lot of us, it probably makes us, react in these different ways. And so I think I think that's interesting to know. I think that's very helpful for our conversation today. And what I really want to focus on, 2 questions that were asked during the pre-poll survey. So you do have an option when you take those surveys to write in your own question. And 2 of those I think are really great for leaders to have as a tool in their toolkit. So I want to take just a minute to answer those. One participant asked, how can you motivate team members who freeze at the slightest hint of adversity? And after taking some time to kind of sit with that and reflect on it, my recommendation would be for that leader to really emphasize improvement rather than perfection. Focusing on improvement drives more improvement, which sounds simple, I know, but that simplicity doesn't make it easy. It's definitely not, something easy to do. And emphasizing improvement over perfection is even more difficult because we as humans really are wired to recognize and focus on the problems or the negatives. And so to drive growth during times of adversity, as a leader, you must focus your team on improvement, not necessarily perfection. And then the other thing that I will say to that is reward progress. You heard my colleague Chelsea Powell say a couple of weeks ago in her webinar that it's so important to celebrate the small victories. And I just want to reiterate that statement that Chelsea made, and to offer more support of it and say that during a time of adversity, your perspective of rewarding people for those small victories is going to be so important. Celebrations, I've kind of come to see them as a fertilizer that helps growth in teams. And that fertilizer, can either really help that team grow and sprout, or it can poison them and send them, back into the flower bed. And so during times of adversity, it may seem like the last thing you want to do or you need to focus on is rewarding progress, especially when it seems like there's so much more to do, right? There's so much more progress that needs to be made. But overlooking those small victories as a leader can become disastrous for your team. And so I think that's, those are two things that I would recommend for those team members who may have that natural reaction of freezing up during a time of adversity. The other question that was asked that I think is a great question is, what are some ways to get myself unstuck during a moment of adversity so that I can lead my team better? And first, I want to recognize that as a leader, asking that question is so important. And so as a leader, having that perspective as, what can I do about this to make myself better for my team? That is serving the needs of your team, and that's fantastic. But, again, after sitting down and thinking about it for a little bit, I thought about this, and really it's at that time that adversity strikes that we as leaders may have to let go of some things that we had planned, or let go of some of that time that we have spent planning things, which is so hard to do, because if there's anything that we can never get back, it's our time. And so I know that saying just let it go is hard, it's a hard thing to hear, but I do think that trying to let go of those things will move you in the right direction. And then, then you realize that those plans that are no longer viable, those aren't the only way to do that, right? To accomplish that goal. And so being able to deal with that situation means that you may have to let go of what some of those pathways looked like. And, resistance at that early stage from you as a leader could actually, again, send your team in a downward spiral that ends up in a lot of despair. And then the other thing that I would say from a perspective standpoint is that for you as a leader to get yourself unstuck in that time when you're like, oh man, this is going to be totally different than what I thought it was, is to shift your perspective to the idea that that moment is now a chance for you to do something meaningful. It is a chance to stretch yourself, stretch your team, kind of test what you're capable of, and figure out what you can do to move forward. Sometimes it feels like acting out of desperation in order to make things right. But I would argue that those states of desperation could be a catalyst for you as a leader that would spark your creativity, that could help you move through this situation and really, again, prevent your perspective from becoming the problem. Because if in those early stages you automatically go to this is a problem, your perspective equals problem, that is going to mean a problem for your team and for your overall effectiveness. And so with that, Tracy, I think it may be a good point for us to stop and see if there are any questions from the attendees.
Thank you so much, Courtney. This is great. And I love what you said about the emerald glasses. What allowed them to see the Emerald City were the glasses that they had on. Mm-hmm. And so, it made me think of this meme. I don't know if you've ever seen it, that has this older woman in a wheelchair. And then she's looking into a mirror, and then she sees like this absolutely beautiful younger ballerina, right? And so they just made me think of perspective, and what we're looking at and what we're thinking about during these chaotic times. So I love that. So I want to share a couple of questions that we do have. We have a question from Chelsea that says, how can you determine the difference between an introduction and interruption in business processes?
That is a really great question, Chelsea. I think in business processes, looking at the difference between an interruption and introduction, how to identify the difference, that was the question, Tracy, right?
Yes. How can you determine the difference between an introduction and interruption in business processes?
So, I think my idea of shifting perspective is that what looks like anything could be an interruption or an introduction, right? It's a matter of how you approach it. So let's say that your department has done things, or your team has done things, the way they've always been done, right? And because of that, the world that we're living in right now feels like an interruption, and you can't do the things the way they have always been done. If your team chooses to sit and wallow in that, then it is an interruption. But the power of that perspective allows, for you and your team to decide, we're not going to let this stop us. This cannot shut us down. We don't have that choice. We have to move on. We have to make this an introduction into the new way of doing things. Going back to that example of museums, I can think about the museums that around the world have opened up for free streaming, literally all over the world, and, places that are typically a very traditional walkthrough experience. You have to see it in person. You have to be there in person to feel it. If they can move from a model of antiquity, which is we have to do this in person, can't we all move to a model of this new introduction into a new way of doing things? And so I think that's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Courtney. And yes, I have another question here from Shayna that says, how do I lead a team of people who are all having differing perspectives of our current situation?
That is a really great question, Shayna. I love that question, because I think that question really ties into, leading a team of different people means that people do have they're bound to have different perspectives, right? And while we're all at home, not physically close to one another and seeing each other for 8 hours a day, those perspectives can quite easily be different from one another. And so I think as a leader, knowing your team and knowing the different ways maybe that they respond to adversity, knowing how a team member might respond to adversity might mean that you might have to give that team member an extra surge of encouragement. But I do think that the most important thing that a leader can do to make sure that everybody is, at least seeing the same perspective is stating what is that perspective. For a leader to be very clear about what the group's mission is at that time and what the process and procedures are, that is how that group can stay unified in that perspective, right? If, Tracy, with both of us being on a team, it may mean that you need, your way of staying focused may be through memes, right? I love your use of a meme there. And so as a leader, Shayna may want to send you a meme to keep you encouraged and to keep that perspective, alive in you. But for me, I love inspirational quotes. Yeah. So, as Shayna being my leader, she may be able to send me that quote, and they still have the same message of what the perspective is, but keeping us all on the same page does require that a leader knows his or her team well.
I love that, Courtney. Meeting people where they are. That's what I think of. And I also think about parents. I've heard so many parents say that they've had to parent each child differently, right? With a different approach. So that makes me think of that as well. Everyone's different. So really meeting each person, where they are. That's all of our questions for now, Courtney. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. And thank you all for submitting those awesome questions. They made me think. So I appreciate that. And so let's jump back into our conversation about perspective and think about, again, this realization that I've come to over the last 2 weeks is kind of along these lines, that our perspective will either get us through this difficult time or it will absolutely drain us, right? And the challenge for a lot of us during the COVID-19 crisis is how we're going to respond to that crisis. And so while we cannot control the presence of the virus, we absolutely can control our attitudes, our daily habits. We can definitely control the way that we treat others and hopefully even empower others while at a socially respectable distance, of course. But, thinking about that idea of control is just something that we've got to wrestle with that and come to the understanding that right now control may not be something that we can exercise over our circumstances around us. But again, that response to it, we absolutely can control. And in thinking about that, I'd love to point to the example of some amazing things that have already happened in our world by great leaders who have handled this this difficult situation well, by focusing in on one group of folks and thinking about, like, last month, zoos and aquariums, like most places of business around the world, were forced to close their doors, and those places being very in-person type of experiences. Did not let them having to close their doors stop them from sharing the joy that comes from their animals with the world. And so they open live feeds like this one up at the Atlanta Zoo, where we get to watch the pandas hang out all day. And so that they wanted to be sure that kids could still enjoy their animals, and so that parents would have something to do with their kids. And I think that is a great specific example of how a lot of organizations around the world and families around the world have dealt with this crisis. They have moved from a model of very in-person experiences to showcasing things through an exhibit, through a streaming program, right? And so organizations, again, like these and so many more examples, have decided that they are going to control what they can control, right? And what they can control is showing their animals to the world. And so they have reached an innovative solution, excuse me. And they have taken what I'm sure was originally perceived as an interruption to their business process and procedures, and turned it into an introduction of new way of doing and experiencing things. And so I think that's a great example, but I also think it's important to note that those organizations had to decide to control what they could control. They had to decide to make that shift in their perspective, and to make that obstacle into an opportunity. And again, they have truly led by a great example of what it looks like to take a stumbling block and turn it into a stepping stone for new ways of doing things in the future. And so so that's our kind of first thing that I want to talk about. Our second thing that I want us to talk about is what matters most. I am not sure if you guys have seen some of the stuff going around the internet about the greatest thinkers of all time and how they have used a pandemic like this one to their advantage. One of the first examples that I saw or read about was Sir Isaac Newton, who, really his contributions to the world of math and science all happened because of his time at home during the outbreak of the plague. And so when his university closed, Cambridge University closed, Newton retreated to his family estate in Lincolnshire, and during that time had a remarkable burst of creativity that really laid the groundwork for his theories of gravity, and even invented calculus, right? And so Isaac is one example. I've also read about William Shakespeare, and according to many resources, he used the plague in London while all of the theaters were shut down. He used that time to write some of his best poems and plays. And I don't want to belittle the fact that both of those men were extremely influential in the world that we live in today. They absolutely were. What I do want to draw your attention to, and what's kind of frustrating about these examples for me, is that Newton and Shakespeare lived in a very different time than what we're living in now. Neither one of them had a whole lot of responsibilities. I mean, Newton was a college student, and at the closing of the school, he then left to go and live a life of leisure at his parents' estate. And Shakespeare, his wife and children were 80 miles away in Stratford upon, and so the point of it is their shelter in place order and their existence looks a little bit different than ours, right? And so they're going through a very different version of social distancing than we are right now. And so I don't want to sit here today and tell you, in fact, I want you to hear me say that working from home does not mean that you have to be hyper productive all of the time. To believe, in my opinion, to believe that the experience or this time would be an absolute waste if you don't walk away from this with a newfound skill is a little bit ludicrous to me, because if we're being real, most of us are not casually lounging around a living space that someone else is paying for. And if you are, great, that's awesome. You have a great setup there. But what I don't want us to focus on is this time being a time for us to accomplish great things, because the truth of it is most of us don't have a whole lot of free time right now, which means we certainly don't have several hours each day to sit around and learn a new language or master a new musical instrument. And so for a lot of us, we actually we may be working harder than we were before COVID-19. We are either working just as hard or harder and are not experiencing, again, the same type of social distancing or culture environment that these guys were. And so what that kind of led me to, and seeing some of those examples, was back to this conversation of what matters most, and believing that each waking hour must be spent being productive is I think a sign of what I will call America's hustle culture, right? And so that hustle culture has made us believe that every nanosecond of our life must be spent to doing something for accomplishment or achievement or self-improvement. And that culture has really forced us to become what we're going to talk about here in just a second, a human doing rather than a human being, right? And so this idea of a human being versus a human doing is not one that I came up with. It's something that I read several years ago in a blog post. Well, I guess it was January of 2018, so about 2.5 years ago. An author or a blogger named Randy Conley, who is the Vice President of Client Services at the Ken Blanchard Institute, or the Ken Blanchard Company, excuse me. So his blog post was called "You Are a Human Being, Not a Human Doing: 3 Steps to Opt Out of the Rat Race." And his message really stuck with me at that time, but is feeling even more relevant today, in my opinion. And so in the post, Conley says, it's very easy for us to forget that we're human beings, not human doings. We get so focused on what we're doing that we forget what to be. He says that we wear our busyness like a badge of honor, when really we should think of it almost as a scarlet letter, because that scarlet letter is showing us that work is more important than our family, or where we spend all of our time is more important than the things that should be important to us. And so that scarlet letter may indicate that our priorities are a little messed up. And so again, that really stuck with me, and I did have to kind of stop and pause then, and I'm doing that again now, and ask myself, when was the last time you really sat down and just quietly reflected for any amount of time? I think that we tend to avoid self-reflection because it's easier to stay busy, right? It's much easier to check our phones and check our emails and stay up to date on current news or social media or celebrity gossip, whatever it is. And I remember being taken aback by that statement then, but even more so at the end of the post, he wraps up by saying, and here's the real trouble with the rat race. The thing is, even if you win the race, you're still a rat. And again, that just really felt very compelling for me at the time to think about my busyness, right? And think about what I could do about it. Well, as it turns out, I never really did anything about it. And again, that was 2.5 years ago. Since then, I've actually taken on more community organizations and activities and social, things like that, and a larger role at work even. And so that's why, so it all kind of got swept under the rug, as it does when you're running that race. And now that we have been forced into this break to really think about so many of those responsibilities, I can't help but feel like we really must reconsider how we spend our time and how we really evaluate the things that do matter the most to us. I threw a couple of quotes on this slide to help us keep in mind the things that we need to remember. But the biggest thing that I want us to remember is that middle statement right there, which is that our value comes from being, not doing. Our place in this world is not earned by the things that we accomplish or that we achieve. Our place in this on this earth comes from us being here and being present in that time. And so really taking time to sit down and reflect on what matters most to you during this time of maybe forced self-reflection a little bit, I think is great. And so, perhaps some of you are experiencing a great time of freedom right now where you will become the next Isaac Newton or William Shakespeare. And I think that's great. I really do. But, I'm not going to put myself into that category because I'm trying to be more realistic. And I'm going to settle for finishing the one book that I started that first week of quarantine that I haven't picked back up yet. I'm going to settle for, just 30 minutes of walking a few times a week. That is me shifting my perspective to realizing that there are things that I can control, and they may be small things, but those small things give me that sense of control back over my life. And so with that, Dreesy, this may be another good time for us to stop for any questions from the group.
Yes, thank you, Courtney. And just to comment a little bit about what you said, I think it might have been 2.5 years ago for me too, when I saw something that said busyness does not equal productivity. And it almost was like a slap in my face.
Absolutely.
And so I just love the reminder that you gave us here. And, for some people, maybe it is a time for them to learn a new skill or to check off a few things, off of their list. But for others, maybe it's just their time to spend with loved ones. And so I think it's important that we understand what our individual times are, because what I'm supposed to be doing during this time may not be what Courtney's supposed to be doing during this time, and not feeling bad for what Courtney does because I haven't done it, and vice versa. So I think just having that self-awareness and knowing, what is supposed to be priority for you right now is very important. So for questions, Courtney, Janicia asks, sometimes it's difficult to see risk as an opportunity. How can you move past pessimism in your mind to be optimistic?
So one of my favorite authors ever is a current author named Tim Elmore, and he talks about this, and I think his example of a habitude, he chooses to teach leadership principles through images, which is really powerful. And his company, Growing Leaders, has more than 100 of them, and so they're fantastic. But he talks about things, or what may be a pessimism or something that's an obstacle. Excuse me. He talks about them in terms of toll booths and roadblocks. And he says things are bound to happen, right? Life is tough. Stuff is going to come up. Those things can either be a gateway, so a toll booth on your journey, right? You do have to stop. You have to pay the price and maybe sacrifice to accomplish that goal. But doing that, paying that price, putting in the hard work means that you can still continue on your journey. Or you can get to that same stop and not have the money or not be willing to work through and pay that price. And then it becomes a roadblock and you have to then turn around and go back, right? Or you don't get to continue on your journey. And so I think, in hearing the question, and I hope I'm answering this correctly for you, Dreesy, and also for Janicia, that, it's all about, again, that perspective. And if that pessimism for you is so often a roadblock rather than a toll booth, I think the awareness of at least knowing that is the first step into, the first step in admitting that you have a problem, if you will. Not that we want to call it a problem, but the first step in admitting that it is a difficult obstacle for you to overcome is recognizing that. And then I would say claiming it, saying it out loud, asking for help from those people around you. If your, natural response to adversity was you're one of those folks that you said, I just get over it, or, I just move on. I don't know that just moving on is always an option. And so what are some of your other options? Again, I think it goes back to somewhat of your preferences. Are there people that you can lean on for support? Are there, things that you can do that will either visually or whatever kind of learner you are that will help you move past that pessimism?
Awesome.
Does that answer the question, Dreesy?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
So one more question for you. How can you seek the perspective of your team without being perceived as a nosy leader?
Oh, I like that. Without being perceived as a nosy leader, that's a great question. I think, that is probably a fear that some of us who are leading a team have. Maybe if our team is fairly new, or if my team does not know me well as a leader, or know me well, from at a distance, which may be the case for a lot of us right now. I think if my team doesn't know me well, me asking their questions may seem nosy, but if I, as a leader, come to them very transparently and start to build that foundation of trust with them and in building a relationship with someone else, you have an exchange, and that really allows you as a leader to be vulnerable and to say to your team, hey, y'all, I don't have all of the answers, right? I don't have all of the solutions right now. I want to reach a solution, but I want your help getting there, right? And saying that to your team up front takes away the preconceived notion, or the perception that you're being nosy, and it takes it into that next level of organizational effectiveness, which is working well together, and acknowledging that none of us can do it on our own. And as a leader, you're then going to be building, again, trust with your team, but also, people love to feel like they have a say in things, right? We are a democratic society. We love feeling like we have input to give. So I would say that most team members probably want to give input, and as long as the leader approaches it very transparently and very genuinely, I would think that most teams would be pretty responsive to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. One last question before we continue. Abby Holland wants to know, do you have a link to the Randy Connolly blog post, and could you share it?
Yes. You have a link. We can absolutely. I will share that with Dreesy and the Leadership Institute team, who will send out the follow-up information as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. That's all of our questions for now.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Dreesy, and thank you, everybody, for those tough questions. I love a tough question, so thank you. So this sudden change in pace and rhythm to our days has certainly been very jarring, right, for a lot of us. But also for us, what has been so difficult about this experience is this new isolation that we're experiencing, this forced isolation from our friends and our coworkers. And my fellow extroverts here, because I live in that world of extroversion, are probably all like, yep, that isolation is hard, right? Being away from my team is not, helping me stay motivated or, drive me forward. And those folks are already planning their team's, next get together or their departmental outing. And those of us who are extroverted, even virtual meetings are not enough for us, right? And when the day comes that we are able to gather in groups again, just everyone prepare yourself for the wave of togetherness that your extroverted friends are going to need. A lot of us extroverts are kind of feeling like Ross from Friends right here, right, where we're trying to convince ourselves that we're fine and that Zoom and FaceTime is good, but that sense of isolation is really difficult for us to deal with. I've even heard from some of my introverted friends friends and colleagues that really thought that this chance to work from home was going to be fine for them, because they do get their energy from themselves, and they're very intrinsically motivated, and even they are realizing that all of this isolation is having an effect on them, and they never realized how much they relied on being around maybe a small group, but nonetheless a group of people. And so what I want us to all realize about this isolation, this forced isolation, is that it can be perceived as a positive thing during this time. I, like a lot of people, I run away from quiet time, right? We feel like have been conditioned to put our earplugs in and make noise instead of sitting in quiet reflection to really think about what we're feeling. And so I think we often associate quiet time with boredom. And so we avoid it because boredom has such a negative connotation to it. And so while it is against contrary belief I know, boredom is actually quite valuable to our growth and our development as humans and certainly as leaders. And in fact, many neuroscientists actually tell us that it's during times of boredom that our brains develop empathy and creativity. And so what I want to encourage you all to think about is how can you shift your perspective of this isolation that we're all feeling right now, and don't jump right to spending every second, every free minute that you may have on FaceTime or Zoom, right? Even for my extroverts, maybe take it back a little bit, right? And try to really take advantage and think of it not as isolation, but as a time of solitude, and let that, spending time in that solitude will really allow you to hear those things that you're thinking and to feel those things that you're thinking, or that you're feeling, excuse me, and really allow those creative juices to start flowing. And getting those creative juices flowing for a leader is so important. And again, times of adversity. But I know for some people that sounds like a foreign concept, because as many of us have observed by now, working from home is certainly not as ideal of an opportunity as we may have originally thought. And so we're being forced to blend our workspace into our personal space. So, and then that, on top of that, that shared space is also being shared with our loved ones. And that love may be growing kind of thin by now. And, I can't help but love this picture of Jimmy Fallon and his daughter. His daughter is literally climbing on top of him while he's trying to work from home, right? And so I've watched several of his spots with his girls and his family during this time. And while I'm sure there is some script to, apologize, y'all, some script to that, I can't help but feel like we are all experiencing something like this. Even those of us who do not have children at home are feeling this pressure of being right on top of each other all the time, right? And all of this togetherness is adding literal weight to our shoulders. And so again, if I can encourage you all to do anything during this time, I want to encourage you, especially those of us who do have loved ones at home with us sharing our space, to find, your different corners of the house. Find your own space, and for, a couple minutes every day or however long you can spare, all spend time in those spaces alone, quietly, again, just trying to listen to your thoughts, to your feelings, and really help you process through all of that together during this time. And so to wrap up our time together, I want to leave you with just a quick little recap of kind of what we've talked about so far, those three, what I will call lessons learned. And this is what I'm going to consider my Newton moment, or my my big discovery during this time. And that is, again, that there are so many things that we don't have control over. What is a very trying time for all of us. But we do have absolute control over our attitude, our habits, and the way we treat others. And so we have control over, we do have control over our perspective, and our perspective of this pandemic may be, again, what is it? Is it an interruption or an introduction? And so those three lessons that I want you to walk away with today are, when we realize that what are the things that we can control and the things that you cannot, you're then able to take ownership of your day, right? When there is no one around you to tell you what to do, you're at home working on your own without your boss being right over you, we should experience some pretty great moments, right? Because those moments, when we take that ownership creates initiative in us, right? And that intrinsic motivation really gets rolling, and we really are able to grow and harness that. And good things happen when we have autonomy over our work. Good things happen when we take something that was a passion or maybe a natural inclination and turn it into a talent, right? And so doing that is, realizing that difference is the first step towards taking ownership over that perspective and over what it is that you're passionate about. The second thing is remember, I told you we have to reflect on what matters most. we all have a life that is very full. One of my favorite things that a former director told to me that really kind of put things into perspective for me was that busy is relative, right? Busy is relative, and we're all busy. We all have a combination of work and family and home and extracurriculars that leaves very little margin of free time in our weeks. And so, however, right now, while life has come to a screeching halt in a lot of those social realms, we have to find out that some of those things that we may have thought were important are no longer important, or they're not as big as we thought maybe they were originally. But we do have to take the time to sit down and reflect on what those things are. And then the last thing is just that, remember, solitude is not a bad thing. Like I said before, I think most people run from the word, or from the idea of solitude, because they think it's boring. And we have been really conditioned to be forever moving in a forward direction where we are constantly trying to make noise or have noise, flooding our thoughts, or just to drown out that boredom. And while there's nothing wrong with constantly being on the go, because I am certainly, in that boat a lot of days, but while there's nothing wrong with that, remember that does actually prevent that creative, original thinking that neuroscientists tells us happen while we're experiencing boredom, right? And that experience, that sitting in that boredom, can then lead to your growth and your development. And so with all of that, I will, leave you with a final thought for today. And that final thought is really a question that I'd love for you to think about over the next little bit, as long as you're able to. And that's this: what is this pandemic for you? Is it an obstacle, or is it an opportunity? And so with that, Tracy, I'll throw it back over for any questions from the group.
Yes, Courtney, we do have a question from Brianna that says, my boss struggles to lead with perspective. How can I address this in a non-leader role?
That's a great perspective to take this question from. Being in a non-leader role, it is difficult to have a leader whose lack of perspective is affecting you and affecting your team in a way that's very visible, that you may be able to offer. You feel like you have some opportunities or some recommendations that you could make, and so being willing and able to offer that to your boss can be a very intimidating thing. I do fall into the category of people who believe that just as much as a boss, it is a boss's or a leader's primary role to build trust among their team and to build those relationships. I do also think that relationship building can come from the other direction, which is a follower role, if you will, or if you're looking at a hierarchy thing, someone of a lower level, maybe a new employee or something like that, but that non-leader role. And I think by, again, having a relationship with your leader or with your boss could allow you to make suggestions and hope that boss may be open to it. But that is going to be up to the leader to have that open mindset. And so, again, that's why I argue that perspective is such an important thing for leaders to have right now, and to have on their minds right now, is how can you be sure that you are hearing the voices of your team? And I don't have a step-by-step plan that I could give Brianna, but I do think that starting with a relationship and maybe kind of testing those waters as to what you do feel the freedom to say to your boss, and kind of take small steps, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so how do you, as a non-leader, influence your leader? I think it's one small step at a time, and that will probably look drastically different based on your team and your roles.
Yeah, that's so good, Courtney. And, I think another thing too, I say this all the time, that it's not the what, but oftentimes it's more so the how.
Yeah.
And so, I think we get so bogged down with the idea of what we're trying to say, and not sitting still to really see how you want to approach it, or, being strategic in that sense. And I think that building relationship is one of those ways for sure. Shannon, I just want to share a comment with you. Shannon says she loved the ideas of interruption versus introduction and obstacle versus opportunity. So I wanted to share that comment with you.
Thank you. I appreciate the words of affirmation is my love language. So Shannon, thank you. And thank you, Dreesy, for sharing that with me.
Of course. This is slightly similar to a previous question, but I will end with this question that says, how do you help employees that are struggling with perspective right now in this pandemic? Courtney, is there anything that you wanted to add just to that overall topic?
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to this idea of, especially right now, just helping people celebrate the fact that they're making it, right? Really helping your team, like emphasizing maybe improvement, but not perfection is what I mentioned earlier. And so really allowing your team to the grace and the freedom right now to experiment and try to improve rather than being perfect. And you know, be sure to celebrate them as you're able to. I think any good leader recognizes that anytime their group gets together, that is an opportunity for celebration and for, you know, praise and for you know, a shot of encouragement into their team. And so anytime you guys are together, your team is together as a staff, you know, through Zoom or whatever platform you're using, be sure to celebrate and say like, hey, you know what, Teresa, you did a great job the other day. Thank you so much for that. And that will really go a long way because people are needing those small victories right now, right? And
Yeah.
You know, knowing that our days are feeling really long and like they're all running together.
Yeah.
Breaking up those days by saying, hey, I saw that you did this and I want to recognize that. I want to say thank you for it. I really think that right now connecting in that way and acknowledging the wins that people are having is very important.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Courtney. Is there anything that you want to add as we move on to next steps?
I think we're good. I just want to say thank you to you and to the Leadership Institute team and to everyone who joined us today. Hopefully you walk away with something that's applicable to your own life.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And thank you all again for joining us today. We will make the slides and a recording of the presentation available on our Facebook page within 48 hours. If you want us to email the information to you, enter your email address in the chat and we'll send them your way. As always, we are interested in your feedback, so take a few moments to complete the post-event survey. You can access it via the QR code or the bit.ly link, which we'll post in the comments. On behalf of the Leadership Institute, thank you for your questions, your interest, and your engagement. If you have any topic ideas, questions, or want additional information, please email us at leadershipinstitute@columbusstate.edu. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.